Alright, so before we start the video proper, I wanted to thank those of you who filled out the Trova Trip survey over the last few videos. We've analyzed your responses and we have found that the best trip that we could plan for you guys would be a trip to Turkey in April of 2024. So that is where we're going. We're going to be visiting, Istanbul, Cappadocia, and a bunch of other places. It's a really neat itinerary. There are 20 spots available on this trip. The first 10 get early bird pricing at $29.95, and the last 10 get normal pricing at $31.95. Now, if you're really serious about taking this trip with me, then I suggest going down into the description below and signing up for email notifications from Trova Trip so they can tell you when these seats go on sale, which should be on August 6th. And if you're on the fence about possibly going on this trip or you have additional questions, then I also have a Google form down in the description below where you could submit questions and I can get answers to you as quickly as I can. I am really looking forward to taking this trip with you guys. It's going to be a lot of fun. Now, without further ado, let's get on with the video.
Like many of you, I watched the Taliban conquer Afghanistan in real time. One of the most famous images from the collapse was that of President Ashraf Ghani fleeing the country with the remnants of its national treasury in a helicopter, which immediately drew comparisons to the fall of Saigon 46 years earlier. Talks of Afghanistan as the new Vietnam had been going on for quite a while, but in the summer of 2021, it saw an insurmountable resurgence. Pundits across the spectrum were certain that Vietnam syndrome had returned.
I'm old enough to remember when Iraq was the new Vietnam, and yet the Iraq War, the one with the weaker justification, is still standing.
The term Vietnam syndrome has been thrown around a lot, and in all honesty, most of its usage has been overblown or downright laughable. What should also be understood is that Vietnam syndrome is an intellectual ailment of American elites rather than the wider public.
So let me take you on a tour of the history of Vietnam syndrome. Where did the term even come from?
Well, if you were to search on Google, the top results will credit the term to either Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan in the mid-70s. But I actually found an earlier instance of the term. The earliest instance I could find of the term was in an article from Foreign Affairs published in January 1969, written by, of all people, Henry Kissinger. After the 1968 election, Richard Nixon would name Henry Kissinger as his national security advisor. And this article was part of an effort by the incoming administration to tell people how Nixon would handle foreign policy differently than Johnson. Prior to this, Kissinger had been a well-respected academic, and his presence in the administration granted an air of intellectual legitimacy to the White House. In this article, Kissinger coins the term Vietnam syndrome, but gives a different definition than we would be familiar with today. The peace negotiations in Paris have been marked by the classic Vietnamese syndrome: optimism alternating with bewilderment, euphoria giving way to frustration.
Now, if you wanted to quibble over details, you could say he came up with the term Vietnamese syndrome, but that feels like an unconscionable level of pedantry.
But as you can see, the definition is quite a bit different. Most definitions of Vietnam syndrome today describe a reluctance to engage in a prolonged war of occupation. But Kissinger's definition instead talks about a process of going back and forth between positive and negative feelings about the ongoing situation. Given the historical context this article was written in, the definition makes sense. Vietnam had only recently become considered an unwinnable war, and even that was mostly amongst activists and intellectuals rather than the public at large.
The earliest usage of Vietnam syndrome in a context that we might recognize it came in April 1974 when former general and ambassador to South Vietnam Maxwell Taylor wrote this in a Foreign Affairs article.
National security, once a trumpet call to the nation to man the ramparts and repel invaders, has fallen into disrepute. A victim of complications arising from the Vietnam syndrome and from its own internal contradictions, it has come to signify in many minds unreasonable military demands, excessive defense budgets, and collusive dealings within the military-industrial complex. Watergate revelations have fueled suspicions that it may be little more than a cover for executive encroachments upon civil liberties and a free press. Taylor's definition of Vietnam syndrome put the more negative spin on it that we are familiar with, but it was written in the context of Watergate, a high tide of distrust in the presidency, which fostered a vast ecosystem of conspiracism that we're still dealing with today. Former Assistant Secretary of State William Bundy extrapolates on this conspiracism in 1979. With the post-Vietnam syndrome, the pendulum then swung in the opposite direction. revelations in 1974 of Mr. Nixon's use of the CIA in Chile in 1970 to 73 against the Allende regime were roundly attacked to the point where these operations were assigned a much greater role than they actually played in Allende's largely self-inflicted downfall. Myths of the right gave way to exaggerations from the left.
He also explained the policy consequences of Vietnam Syndrome.
What appeared to be taking shape was, if not a consensus, at least a dominant opinion that tended to limit critical American security interests to the strategic balance with the Soviet Union, treaty commitments in the NATO area, Japan and Korea, and the long-standing moral commitment to Israel. In the aftermath of Nixon and Watergate, Congress began placing restrictions on presidential actions, believing this would prevent future Vietnams. The Church Committee did a lot to foster more conspiracism as it exposed a bunch of CIA operations, much of which was out of context and made the organization look a lot more powerful and omnipresent than they really were. They also passed the Hughes-Ryan Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act. It mandated that the president inform the members of certain congressional committees about any operations the CIA was involved in. In 1974, these committees constituted over 200 members of Congress, which resulted in a lot of intelligence leaks. Consequently, the CIA drastically curtailed their own operations for fear of those leaks. It also made working with foreign intelligence services more difficult because their operations would also have to be reported to Congress. In 1976, they added the Tunney Amendment to the Defense Appropriations Act of 1976, which prohibited the CIA from using any funds for activities in Angola that weren't about gathering intelligence. Angola sent a clear signal to the Soviets and their Cuban proxies. They knew that the risk of US intervention was low, and the possibility of continued US assistance to pro-Western factions slim. Soviet and Cuban airlifts to Angola slowed down briefly when Ford gave a warning to the Soviet ambassador, but after the Tunney Amendment, they resurged. In 1980, former President Richard Nixon was of the opinion that the US shouldn't have gotten involved in Vietnam, believing that we should have limited our role to that of arms suppliers and advisors. In Vietnam, during that period, we were not subtle enough in waging the guerrilla war, we were too subtle in waging the conventional war. We were too patronizing, even contemptuous, toward our ally, and too solicitous of our enemy. Vietnamese morale was sapped by Americanization of the war. American morale was sapped by perpetuation of the war. Democracies are not well equipped to fight prolonged wars. A democracy fights well after its morale is galvanized by an enemy attack and it gears up its war production. This is doubly true when the war is being fought half a world away. We Americans are a do-it-yourself people. During the period, we failed to understand that we could not win the war for the South Vietnamese.
The same year, we have Richard Nixon publishing a book that talks about how we shouldn't have been involved in Vietnam. We have then presidential candidate Ronald Reagan saying,
"We've lived with the Vietnam Syndrome. Much of that syndrome has been created by the North Vietnamese aggressors who now threaten the peaceful people of Thailand. Over and over, they told us for nearly 10 years in that war that we were the aggressors, bent on imperialistic conquests. They had a plan. It was to win in the field of propaganda here in America what they could not win on the field of battle in Vietnam. The years dragged on. We were told that peace would come if we would simply stop interfering and go home. Well, it's time that we recognized ours was in truth a noble cause. A small country, newly free from colonial rule, sought our help in establishing self-rule and the means of self-defense against a totalitarian neighbor bent on conquest. We dishonor the memory of 50,000 young Americans who died in that cause when we give way to feelings of guilt, as if we were doing something shameful.
Between the 1980s and 1990s, we see this divergence of thinking solidify between the right and left on Vietnam Syndrome, with the Democratic Party opposing most if not all military interventions, and the Republicans tending to be more supportive. Reagan and the neoconservatives wanted the US to have a more active foreign policy, believing it could reshape the world for the better, but Vietnam Syndrome, at least amongst policymakers, was still a powerful force. In the Reagan years, this dichotomy is best exemplified by Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and Secretary of State George Shultz. Reading their memoirs side by side gives you this story of Shultz wanting to utilize the military more in diplomacy, while Weinberger constantly wants more problems resolved by the State Department. Both believed in a strong military, but Weinberger's contention was that we shouldn't commit to military action that we aren't willing to follow through on with policy and congressional support. He was undoubtedly under the influence of Vietnam Syndrome. But But over the course of the 1980s, we gradually saw the US use its military might more frequently, but they were always used in short operations. The intervention into Lebanon ended up being a failure, but future interventions in Grenada, Honduras, Libya, the Persian Gulf, and Panama proved quite successful. And at the time, many saw the Gulf War as curing Vietnam Syndrome.
A 1991 Washington Post article would define Vietnam Syndrome as
the belief that any large-scale military intervention abroad was doomed to practical failure and perhaps also to moral iniquity. There was a lot of talk about the US overcoming Vietnam Syndrome, but many feared this as a bad thing, with most of them commenting that not all opponents would be as easily defeated or as morally evil as Saddam.
In another funny turn of events, this article defines a newly minted Iraq Syndrome.
A belief in the invincibility of American might. In a 2009 article in the Weekly Standard, Max Boot wrote about how Iraq became the new Vietnam, despite the fact that things on the ground were substantially better than they had been in Southeast Asia. Iraq was difficult, but hardly an irretrievable disaster, and certainly not a Vietnam-sized disaster. After 6.5 years of war, the United States has lost over 4,300 service personnel in Iraq, a sobering and substantial figure, but still 13 times fewer fatalities than we suffered in Vietnam. Just as important, all indications in Iraq are that we are winning. A history of being consistently wrong has not deterred all those boomers who came of age in the 1960s from once again evoking the specter of you-know-what to warn against involvement in Afghanistan. We saw Vietnam Syndrome invoked throughout the Obama presidency as well. It had never really left, but it has now returned unmistakably, certain to exercise a major influence on American foreign policy during Barack Obama's second term in office. Despite this, President Obama would still send the US military back to Iraq to defeat ISIS in 2014, when it looked like the country might fall to Islamist extremists, something that President Ford wasn't able to do back in 1975.
Throughout this video, I have mentioned or inferred that Iraq Syndrome was not something that the wider public actually has, but rather is mostly a neurosis of American elites and policymakers. And this sense has been described as early as the early 90s.
I think the Vietnam Syndrome has been overplayed for a long time. We used force against Gaddafi, we used force against Panama, we used force against Grenada. Although these were relatively small engagements, we clearly were not restrained in our use of force.
A 2023 article in Foreign Affairs defines Vietnam Syndrome as an intellectual ailment of elites.
A pathological belief that public support for the use of force was too fleeting, and the US military's power too uncertain for foreign military operations to be advisable.
It points to Iraq, still standing 20 years later, as an example of successful US intervention, albeit one purchased at a tragically high price.
2 decades after the initial invasion, Iraq remains a security project in progress. Compared with the United States' outright defeat in Afghanistan, the result of the US campaign in Iraq looks like a modest success, albeit at a tragically high price. But compared with the expectations of the war's advocates, Iraq looks like a fiasco in the mold of Vietnam.
It also coins a new Iraq Syndrome, which has since overwritten the 1991 Iraq Syndrome, just as Maxwell Taylor's 1974 article rewrote Kissinger's Vietnam Syndrome.
And the shock has had the same result. Policymakers have developed Iraq Syndrome and now believe that the American public has no stomach for military operations conducted on foreign soil. Americans are casualty phobic. They will support a military operation only if the cost in American lives is minimal. As a consequence, US policymakers who wish to use force must fight as bloodlessly as possible and be quick to abandon their commitments if the adversary proves able to fight back and kill US soldiers. The politically expedient position in a world afflicted by Iraq Syndrome is a quasi-isolationist one, since the public is not willing to underwrite the costs of lasting international commitments. It goes on to criticize policymakers' obsession with avoiding future Vietnams and future Iraqs, saying it prevents the US from exercising its power in meaningful and productive ways, and how the US has had 3 consecutive presidents whose primary foreign policy goal was lessening the US military's footprint abroad. But they suggest that the American public is more open to it than policymakers realize. Polling suggests that rather than reflexively opposing war, the US public makes reasoned trade-offs when deciding whether to support the use of force. Thanks again to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. Check out the top link in the description to get a 14-day free trial to MyHeritage, and if you decide to continue your subscription after the trial, then you will get 50% off by using my code down in the description. Also, if you are interested in taking a trip with me to Turkey in April of 2024, then go down to the description to sign up for email notifications for when the seats go on sale. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.